In the quiet, picturesque town of Willow Creek, there stood an old Victorian house at the edge of the woods. Emily, a 29-year-old freelance writer, had recently moved in, seeking solitude and inspiration for her next novel. The house was perfect for her needs, spacious, isolated, and brimming with character. However, the townspeople often whispered about the house's eerie history, mentioning strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances. Emily, a skeptic, dismissed these stories as mere folklore. As the days passed, Emily settled into her new home, enjoying the tranquility. But soon she began to notice odd things. It started with small, almost unnoticeable incidents: the feeling of being watched, objects slightly out of place, and cold drafts in rooms with no windows open. At first, she attributed these sensations to her imagination and the newness of the house. One evening, as Emily sat at her desk writing, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound. She paused, listening intently. The tapping continued, seemingly coming from the attic. Remembering the townspeople's warnings, a shiver ran down her spine, but she brushed it off, determined to prove to herself that there was nothing to fear. Armed with a flashlight, Emily ascended the narrow, creaky stairs to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. She reached the attic door and hesitated, recalling the whispered warnings, but her curiosity overpowered her caution. She opened the door, revealing a dusty, cluttered space filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. As she swept the flashlight beam across the room, she noticed a rocking chair in the corner, slowly rocking back and forth. A chill ran down her spine, but she approached it cautiously. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and she heard a faint whisper. "Leave now." Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper grew louder and more insistent. "Leave now." Panicked, Emily turned to leave, but the attic door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. The whispers intensified, and she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She screamed and banged on the door, pleading for help. The temperature dropped further, and she could see her breath in the air. Desperate, Emily remembered an old family portrait she had found in the attic earlier, depicting a family from the early 1900s. She realized the house must be haunted by their spirits. She found the photo and held it up, speaking to the ghosts, asking for forgiveness for disturbing their peace. The whispers stopped, and the temperature began to rise. The attic door creaked open, and Emily rushed out, slamming it behind her. She knew she could never go back up there. The next day, she researched the house's history and discovered that the family in the photo had perished in a tragic fire, with the attic being the epicenter. Their spirits were trapped, reliving their final moments. Emily decided to leave the house, unable to live with the constant fear and the memories of that night. She sold it to a couple who were aware of its history and planned to restore the attic to honor the lost family. Emily moved on, but the experience changed her. She never forgot the whispers in the attic and the cold touch of the unseen. Years later, the couple who bought the house reported seeing the rocking chair move on its own and hearing faint whispers, but they felt a sense of peace rather than fear. The spirits seemed to have found some solace, knowing their story was finally acknowledged and respected. Then, one night, Emily received a package at her new home. Inside was the old family portrait from the attic with a note written on the back, "You can't leave us." As she stared at the photo in horror, the temperature in her house began to drop, and she heard the familiar whisper, "Leave now." In the bustling city of Chicago, 30-year-old Sarah was struggling to make ends meet. Working two part-time jobs and attending night classes left her exhausted and constantly stressed about money. So when she saw an ad on a community board offering $500 for a simple house-sitting gig, she jumped at the opportunity. The ad was from a woman named Mrs. Turner, who needed someone to watch her house for a weekend while she visited her sister. The house was located in an upscale neighborhood, and the payment was generous. Sarah contacted Mrs. Turner, who seemed kind and genuine, and they arranged for Sarah to start the next Friday evening. On Friday, Sarah arrived at the house just as the sun was setting. The house was large and elegant, with a manicured lawn and an ornate iron gate. Mrs. Turner greeted her warmly and gave her a quick tour, showing her the living room, kitchen, bedrooms, and a cozy study filled with books. She also handed Sarah a list of instructions. "Just a few things to keep in mind," Mrs. Turner said with a smile. Make sure to lock all the doors at night, feed the cat twice a day, and please, whatever you do, don't go into the basement. Sarah found the last instruction odd, but didn't think much of it. After all, every house had its quirks. Mrs. Turner left, and Sarah settled in, feeling a bit like she was on vacation in a luxurious home. The first night was uneventful. Sarah watched TV, ate a frozen pizza, and went to bed early. But the next day, things started to get strange. While feeding the cat in the morning, she heard faint rhythmic tapping sounds coming from the basement. Remembering Mrs. Turner's warning, she decided to ignore it. Throughout the day, Sarah felt an increasing sense of unease. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The tapping sounds continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but never stopping. That evening, as she sat in the study trying to distract herself with a book, the power suddenly went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the rhythmic tapping from the basement grew louder, almost insistent. Sarah's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone to use its flashlight. Guided by the small beam of light, she made her way to the kitchen to find some candles. As she lit them, she noticed that the basement door, which had been firmly closed, was now slightly ajar. A cold draft wafted up from the darkness below. Terrified but unable to ignore it any longer, Sarah decided to investigate. She grabbed a heavy flashlight from a drawer and slowly descended the creaky wooden stairs into the basement. The air grew colder, and the tapping grew louder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah shone her flashlight around the room. It was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. In the far corner, she saw an old wooden chest, and the tapping seemed to be coming from inside it. Summoning all her courage, Sarah approached the chest and, with trembling hands, lifted the lid. Inside, she found an old metronome, its pendulum swinging back and forth, creating the tapping sound. But that wasn't what made her scream. There, underneath the metronome, was a faded photograph of a young woman who looked exactly like Sarah. The woman in the photo was standing in front of the very house Sarah was in, with the date stamped on the back, October 31st, 1920. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, and the temperature dropped further. Sarah felt a presence behind her and turned slowly to see a shadowy figure looming in the darkness. It whispered her name in a chilling voice. Panic surged through Sarah as she sprinted up the stairs, banging on the basement door until it flew open. She ran through the house, grabbing her things, and fled into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached her apartment, heart pounding and breath ragged. The next day, she tried calling Mrs. Turner, but the number was disconnected. She drove back to the house, only to find it abandoned and boarded up. A neighbor, seeing her confusion, approached and said, "That house has been empty for years, ever since the Turners disappeared back in 1920. Sarah never went back to that part of town again. She couldn't explain what happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Some doors should never be opened, and some mysteries are better left unsolved." In the small, quiet town of Ashwood, there stood an old, dilapidated mansion at the end of a long, winding road. 28-year-old Lily had recently inherited the mansion from her late grandmother. Seeking a fresh start after a rough year, Lily moved in, eager to restore the house and perhaps find some solace. As Lily settled in, she began to notice odd things. It started with small, almost unnoticeable incidents. Items slightly out of place, doors creaking open by themselves, and cold drafts in rooms with no windows open. At first, she attributed these sensations to the house's age and her imagination. However, the occurrences grew more frequent and unsettling. One evening, as Lily was reading in the living room, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the basement. She paused, listening intently. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Determined to prove to herself there was nothing to fear, she decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, Lily descended the narrow, creaky stairs to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. She reached the bottom and hesitated, but curiosity overpowered her caution, and she opened the basement door. The basement was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. As she moved the flashlight beam around, she noticed a large, antique mirror in the corner. The tapping sound was now louder and seemed to be coming from behind the mirror. With trembling hands, she moved the mirror aside, revealing a hidden door. She opened the door and found a small, dark room. Inside, she saw a figure huddled in the corner, whispering softly. The figure turned, revealing a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. It was her grandmother. The whispers grew louder, repeating Lily's name over and over. She felt a cold hand brush against her arm, and the figure lunged at her. Lily screamed and ran back up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She locked herself in her room, trembling and trying to process what she had just seen. The whispers continued, echoing through the house, growing louder and more insistent. The next day, Lily researched the house's history and discovered that her grandmother had dabbled in dark rituals, trapping restless spirits in the basement. Their whispers were a cry for release. Unable to live with the constant fear and the memories of that night, Lily decided to leave the mansion. She sold it to a couple who were aware of its history and planned to cleanse the house of its dark past. Lily moved on, but the experience changed her. She never forgot the whispers and the cold touch of the unseen. Years later, Lily tried to move on with her life. She found a new home and began to settle in. One day, she received a call from the new owners of the mansion. They seemed distressed and insisted on meeting with her. Curiosity and a sense of responsibility drove her to agree. When she arrived at the mansion, the couple looked exhausted and fearful. They led her to the basement, where they had discovered an old, leather-bound journal hidden behind the same antique mirror. The journal belonged to her grandmother and detailed the rituals she had performed, including one final, unfinished ritual meant to release the trapped spirits. The couple begged Lily to help them complete the ritual, believing it was the only way to end the disturbances they were experiencing. Despite her fear, Lily felt a strange sense of duty and agreed. As they gathered the necessary items and followed the instructions in the journal, the atmosphere in the mansion grew increasingly oppressive. Whispers filled the air, and shadows seemed to move on their own. The final step of the ritual required them to recite an incantation in the hidden room behind the mirror. With trembling hands, Lily led the way. The couple followed closely, clutching each other for support. As they spoke the final words of the incantation, a chilling wind swept through the room, extinguishing their candles and plunging them into darkness. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, and the cold touch of unseen hands brushed against them. Suddenly, there was silence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the room felt lighter, almost peaceful. They cautiously exited the basement and found that the house no longer felt haunted. The couple thanked Lily profusely, relieved to finally have peace in their home. Lily returned to her new home, hoping that the spirits had found the release they sought. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. As the days passed, she began to notice odd things once more. Items slightly out of place, doors creaking open by themselves, and cold drafts in rooms with no windows open. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound. It was coming from the attic. With a sense of dread, she realized that the spirits might not have been released after all. They had followed her. Determined to face whatever was haunting her, Lily climbed the attic stairs, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder with each step, and an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. She reached the attic door and hesitated, but curiosity and a sense of responsibility overpowered her caution, and she opened the attic door. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. As she moved the flashlight beam around, she noticed a large, antique mirror in the corner. The tapping sound was now louder and seemed to be coming from behind the mirror. With trembling hands, she moved the mirror aside, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside the compartment was another journal, identical to her grandmother's. As she opened it, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent than ever before. The final entry in the journal was a message to Lily. The ritual was never meant to release them. It was meant to bind them to you. You are their keeper now. Horrified, Lily realized the truth. Her grandmother had not been trying to release the spirits. She had been passing on the responsibility. The spirits were bound to the family, and now they were bound to her. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with their pleas and cries. The cold touch of the unseen spirits surrounded her, and she knew there was no escape. The mansion had never been haunted by the spirits of strangers. It had been haunted by her family's past, and now it was her burden to bear.